Thank you so much for joining me today. My guest is Lama Elhatow. Lama is a program coordinator and a lecturer at Environmental Science and Policy Program, as well as the Energy Policy and Climate Program at Johns Hopkins. Lama, it's a pleasure to have you join us.
Thank
And
you.
I understand you've been participating in COP negotiations recently. Probably you were out in Dubai during the days of COP28. If I am to ask you to reflect broadly on where we are in the MENA region in terms of climate mitigation and adaptation, as well as the topic of energy transition, which has emerged prominently in COP28 in Dubai, uh, which which key points would you push forward in terms of status of the region from a climate change and energy transition perspective?
Thank you. Thank you, Amr, and thank you for the Institute for also having me and hosting me on this series. It's an honor to be on this climate interview series. So I would say that in speaking with the COP28 climate negotiations and what occurred in Dubai specifically this last December was for the very first time, a very pivotal mark of success did actually occur where we did actually incorporate transitioning away of fossil fuels into the COP climate negotiation text. This is something that we've been discussing and we've been pushing for as climate activists and as academics and scientists for many, many years now. I would say the bottleneck has primarily been between language of phasing down versus phasing out of fossil fuels.
Mhm.
Transitioning away from fossil fuels, which is the current language that has been incorporated into the text, has been, of course, criticized by many as too little, too late. But one of the pivotal things that I think we do need to mark is that we do, in fact, have that kind of language in the text at this point in time, which is very important and has never been done. That being said, it doesn't, I think when we come to think and consider the COP climate change negotiations, with the criticism that it might be too little too late in a lot of the facets that we move, and it may that may in fact be the case, is that it's not the only front where we need to work and we need to have climate action. It's very important that we continue to work both on the international spectrum in terms of how we engage with the COP process and making sure that we have binding commitments on all countries, but that we also work domestically in our own countries in making sure that climate action is happening and being implemented on the ground, specifically with vulnerable communities, with indigenous communities, with the most impacted low income, impoverished communities that will be hit by the brunt of climate change the most. So I would say in the MENA region, in the Arab world particularly, there's been some very positive traction in taking those steps forward. There's been energy transitions that have been attempted to take place in many countries, particularly Egypt has been a very big one. The UAE, Saudi Arabia is looking into it. Morocco has done some very, very admirable work as well. So I would say that there have been prime examples of how to move that forward. But I would say that what differentiates energy transition from a just energy transition is making sure that when we do particularly come to transition to renewable energies and thus that we aren't leaving anyone behind. And when I mean just here, we particularly talk about those that have been employed by, for instance, the oil and gas sector, by the coal sector, that would end up losing their jobs or not having and becoming impoverished, so that we do ensure that people's livelihoods are that they are intact and that we aren't leaving anyone behind with respect to the energy transition. This is a
Right.
very, very big part
Right.
of the process.
Yes, let me push you a bit more on the question of how to differentiate energy transition from just energy transition or transitions in the Middle East and North Africa. And you were already referring to the question of impacted segments of the population, and you give a very concrete example with regard to those employed in the energy sector. In the region, it has an additional component, which is basically that the oil exporting countries, oil and natural gas exporting countries, have been receiving workers and guest workers from oil and natural gas non-exporting countries or non-producing countries, primarily outside of the Gulf, and of course, with the exception of Algeria. Can you give us a sense of what kind of policy proposals or policy tools are out there to account for the expected loss of jobs or the expected loss of revenues, be it at the individual level or at the respective population segment level or at the national level? Because a country like Jordan, for example, would be highly impacted by loss of jobs in the Gulf of its population.
Not just Jordan, all of the countries actually have this recurring problem.
Hmm.
And I would, you're also very correct in that a lot of these countries do employ migrant workers coming from, for instance, South Asia or otherwise, that would also very much be impacted. So
Hmm.
the idea here when we talk about just energy transition is, as I mentioned, making sure that we do provide employment opportunities and livelihoods for those working in the oil and gas and coal sectors. Now, how do we ensure that? One of the biggest studies that's also been conducted is ensuring that with the transition to renewable energies, that green jobs can be particularly motivated and employed within specific sectors to make sure that we have that transition from anyone working within infrastructure projects like coal can transition smoothly to, for instance, solar power plants or wind farms or otherwise. The problem that lies specifically in this kind of transition for people, for instance, working in a coal fire plant towards a solar plant, is not necessarily the technical skills or know-how, because a lot of what can be gained is very simple when it comes to vocational trainings and otherwise. So that can definitely be done through training, capacity building, and otherwise. The problem is that some of the sectors, with specifically renewable sectors like solar powered plants, for instance, or wind farms, employ a very, very large number during the construction phase, but during O&M and operation phase, operation and maintenance, actually end up having um, don't really require that much. It's almost actually a third of what they employ during the construction phase. So in that, yes, for the first couple of years, there would be that transition where we can have a lot of those people working in the construction power plants, but then there would need to be a shift in order to make sure that there is sustainability for their employment opportunities. How do we avoid doing this? In the fact that we have a drastic desire and drastic need to continue to construct several renewable energy projects across the region and in various places where we do need to continuously have this moving around from plant to plant, basically.
Hmm.
That being said, that is definitely one aspect where we need to ensure that employment opportunities are upheld. But the just energy transition is not only with those that are employed in the energy sector, such as oil and gas and coal. It's also very much involved in how do we deal, for instance, with fossil fuel subsidies.
Hmm.
As many of you know, of course, that fossil fuel subsidies, the original intention for fossil fuel subsidies was to help the most impoverished segments of society. But what we've now come to understand is in fact what ends up happening is that fossil fuel subsidies ends up having what we refer to as the 80-20 disparity, in that 80% of the fossil fuel subsidies goes to cater to 20% of the wealthiest or most affluent elite of the population, which doesn't cater to its original intention.
Hmm.
If that is the case, and we're hence with fossil fuel subsidies not allowing, for instance, renewable energy to be as competitive as oil and gas and as coal and many of these other fossil fuels. That's one problem. Is that market competitiveness in terms of renewable energies. But the second one is also actually not having problems with inflation, as we're typically seeing in many of the Arab region countries, such as Egypt and otherwise. But we're also not helping the impoverished segment the most. So, how do we begin to do that in a just energy transition is a very big part of making sure that if we are removing or transitioning away from fossil fuels and including with it fossil fuel subsidies, how does that affect the commodities? How does that affect the market? How does that food security for our region? What does that mean for a lot of the impoverished segments that do require the assistance of these subsidies? And how do we cater to them and help them? That is a very, very big part of making sure that we do not leave anyone behind in this just energy
Right.
transition.
And are you seeing best practices anywhere around the region? I mean, you referred with regard to admirable efforts at mitigating, adapting to climate change, and working the path forward with regard to just energy transitions to Morocco, to Egypt, to the UAE. Can you share a reflection or some reflections on best practices around the region, which can help in understanding how it could be done?
I think when it comes to For subsidies, that's a difficult one. But what I will reflect on is a little bit more in terms of infrastructure and how that's being managed in some of the countries. There is a rampant shift towards moving towards renewables across the region. Egypt is one that is moving quite strong. Morocco is moving towards solar and wind very, very strong. Even not just in terms of energy, but also in the transportation sector, moving towards public transportation systems, both in many of these countries. But I would like to give a case example of one. I wouldn't call it a best practice. It's actually one where we intend to look at how to do things a little differently, I'll say. In Saudi Arabia, one of the initiatives that they currently did in Riyadh was implement a fantastic metro system, public transportation system across Riyadh, where they've powered by clean energy across the entire area so that they can have communication for transportation across the entire city. The problem with the metro with the metro system or the subway system that exists in Riyadh is that for the first 6 months, no one was using it. And the problem with it is that there wasn't any socioeconomic feasibility study that was conducted to basically understand whether or not the cultural habits and cultural shifts of the Saudi population would actually move towards taking public transportation and metro systems or otherwise. And as you know, many of the migrant workers coming from South Asian communities, for instance, often are also relying on vehicles because they end up living in the outskirts and otherwise, where the metro doesn't necessarily service at this point in time. So even those lower income persons were not taking the metro because of those reasons. So here you have a country like Saudi Arabia attempting to move to a green transition, particularly with its in many of these sectors, such as transportation, but is missing a very valuable gap in such a study like the socioeconomic feasibility study to understand whether or not and how it can actually cater to the population with its cultural, social fabric of society, making sure that also such a thing like vehicles are in fact a social status, a prestige status in many countries of the Arab world. So how is that shift towards taking public transportation perceived to the public and to consumers? Will it be something that will be adopted, or is it something that will actually end up being empty, as we saw for a very long time in Riyadh? So that's, I would
Mhm.
say, something that we need to put into consideration when we do look at these green transitions in any sector, in energy, in agriculture, in water, in transportation, in infrastructure, to be able to see how does it particularly contextually adapt to the social fabric and the cultural aspects of society. I think that this is very, very
Mhm.
important.
Right. I mean, let me raise maybe a second consideration, which policymakers in the region and those working on the region from outside of the region need to be attentive to, which is the fact that, for example, some of the renewable energy projects do raise concerns about the use of limited resources. For example, some of the renewable energy projects related to the green hydrogen are or have come to be in question because of the use of really limited water resources in the region. There are some other issues with regard to how to prioritize from an access approach, resource management in a way which adds to the relative advantages of a country like Morocco, for example, which can continue to depend on wind and solar energy in terms of producing renewable energy, but where maybe the question of green hydrogen, given the fact that it consumes a lot of limited water resources, should be deprioritized. The same maybe is relevant in Egypt or in Jordan or elsewhere. So when you look at the region from a macro perspective, Lama, what kind of contestation around resources or what kind of prioritization do policymakers need to be aware of?
No, thank you for that, Amr. That's a great point. I think it's important when we look at a lot of these new technologies that we try to understand and contextualize them to the region specifically. So let's use the example that you just brought, which is green hydrogen.
Mhm.
Green hydrogen is a multifold process because it requires fresh water. It doesn't require, and so it because basically you're splitting the atom of H2O from hydrogen, and then oxygen is dissipated into the air. Through this process of electrolysis, it's a very energy intensive process, but it's also a very water intensive process. As you clearly mentioned, many of the countries in the region are in fact water scarce. So that being said, if we're actually relying on fresh water in order to be able to create this kind of an energy source, wherein a lot of our population may be going through water poverty situations and water scarcity, it becomes very, very problematic, which is why green hydrogen projects have been particularly pegged to be utilized on coastal zones specifically so that they can utilize seawater, so that there is this mode of desalination from seawater that is then being used for the electrolysis process. But then
But
you have a
then,
two.
but then you have a big question on the financial component of the desalination projects and who can afford it, and if you're competing with regard from a resource perspective, if you're creating a competition between desalination projects and maybe sustainable human development projects in a place like Morocco. Once again, I'm always reflecting on the financial, economic, social, overall developmental situation in these countries. Can Morocco, for example, afford to invest a lot in desalination projects, or is it better off focusing on sustainable developmental projects and maybe from an energy perspective, prioritizing wind and solar energy?
It's not a one size fits all for a
Hmm.
country or for a context. It depends it's very contextually specific. So
Hmm.
for instance, you would say in coastal zones such as for instance, if you're looking at Ouarzazate or Casablanca in Morocco, yes, it might actually be applicable. If you're looking at inland, obviously cities, obviously not. That doesn't make any sense for you to begin to develop that kind of technology in those cases. Similarly, in Egypt, for instance, if you're looking at North Coast or Mediterranean, potentially green hydrogen could be an opportunity. Around the Red Sea, definitely also potentially an opportunity. How does it favor in terms of economic costs? This is where the private sector is very important in coming in to make sure that these kinds of things are incentivized and developed utilizing private sector resources and not public sector resources. This is the key here. If we take an example such as the Benben solar plant in Aswan in the south of Egypt, Benben, this is a project that actually is very close to my heart because I was the lead environmental specialist working on this project, a part of IFC with the World Bank. And with this project, a lot of the 1.8 gigawatts that was developed by private sector developers that were coming in to develop this project was to ensure several components. One, of course, that the social community of Aswan and Binban were employed in the opportunity within the actual site itself. So this is a very big part, also again, of just energy transition. But secondly, is that the energy that is being produced also is provided in terms of access to the communities surrounding the area. And making sure that the private sector developers that do ensure that the energy that is generated is going back to feed the national grid through the smart grid system, obviously with the revenue for the private sector developers, but that the public sector is then getting the benefits from private sector development. And I think that that's the key when we talk about how to engage the private sector and also hold them accountable in a lot of cases, because private sector does reap the benefits of in some cases cheap labor, cheap resources, cheap
Right, or
commodities,
energy subsidies.
of course.
Yes.
So
Hmm.
holding them accountable is a
Hmm.
big part of this too.
Hmm. Okay, so Lama, thank you so much for your contextualization. Let me zoom out a bit to benefit from your expertise. And we at Carnegie have been looking from a research correlation perspective at climate change, vulnerability, and governance. So we've been trying to understand in a case by case approach and a country specific approach, trying to understand how climate change has been impacted by pre-existing vulnerabilities and governance deficits, and how climate change has come to impact social or socioeconomic vulnerabilities as well as governance deficits. So, if you are to outline key challenges we're facing, which are induced by climate change, or where climate change is a threat multiplier or a multiplier of sorts, which key challenges would you outline for the region, factoring in, of course, the differences between oil exporting or energy exporting and energy importing countries? What should we focus on from a research perspective?
So this is one of the things that I teach to my students, and that specifically looking at vulnerability is that vulnerability is the vulnerability risk assessment minus your adaptive capacity. What does that mean? Is that you have the potential risk, such as let's take something like extreme weather events, a storm. An extreme weather event or a storm can be, you can have the same risk, the same vulnerability risk assessment in for instance, a country like Libya versus the same risk in a country like the USA. Let's use the storms that hit specifically in Libya back in 2023 with the storm Daniel versus Hurricane Katrina that hit New Orleans in 2007 to the United States. Both were hit by storms, devastating events. But what differs here, so here we would calculate the vulnerability risk assessment is probably almost about the same. It's the same risk as opposed to what could happen. But what differs here is the adaptive capacity. And adaptive capacity here refers to everything from the infrastructure, the resources, drainage systems that allow it to happen, human resources that are able to mobilize in order to deal with disaster risk reduction. So in the case, for instance, of Hurricane Katrina, you had the military was deployed immediately. FEMA came to also be able to provide assistance to that storm and to the floods in New Orleans from the hurricane. And the country and the city was able to bounce back. Obviously, it took some time, but it was able to bounce back fairly quickly. Versus in Libya in 2023, when the floods happened in Derna, the dam was completely devastated. The floods completely devastated the entire, not just Derna specifically as a city, but also many of the Sahara Desert has been flooded. Homes were devastated, agricultural fields. And until today, here we are in 2024, several months later, and we have not been able to deal with the devastation that we have seen in Libya until today. So these kinds of losses and damages that we refer to within the climate negotiations also, in how do we compensate communities specifically for this kind of damage that is going to be irreversible and permanent, is very important to discuss, but it's also to be able to see how we as a region can enhance our resilience and our adaptive capacity to make sure that the vulnerability risks that do happen within our region are accounted for and we are better prepared for it. Because the sad truth is we will continue to see more and more of these as we move forward.
Right. I mean, one of the key deficits which have been outlined in relation to their disaster has been, from a governance perspective, the fact that endemic corruption in Libya has prevented a great deal of maintenance work which was needed to protect the dam that collapsed, as well as to prepare different municipalities in Derna and around Derna for extreme weather events. To the extent that there were even resource allocations made on the side of the Libyan government and delivered to the municipalities and to the city of Derna, but never used. So, in a way, it showcases not only the danger, the imminent danger because of climate change, which we are all exposed to, but it shows how it gets way worse, not only from a vulnerability perspective, but also from a governance deficit perspective. That if you're not up to speed, if you're not ready, if you're not getting your even decision making processes in a solid way to be able to mitigate and adapt and respond, you are at a big risk of paying a very heavy price. So, from a governance perspective, Lama, what kind of deficits do you see across the region? Is it maybe that our policy making processes are not inclusive, that vulnerable communities are not included? Is it maybe that we are facing institutions which have been outdated or lack institutional capabilities similar to the US? I mean, you were just comparing between Hurricane Katrina and Daniel Storm, which hit Derna. So how do you see that?
I think a very big part of it is making sure that those that need to deal with particular disasters and climate change specifically are not speaking to themselves in silos. Is that they are in fact speaking to one another. One of the biggest problems we would have, I think, in our region is that many of our ministries specifically are very much siloed in dealing with issues
Yes.
by themselves. So agricultural sector, the
Yeah.
water ministry, energy ministry,
Yeah.
and they don't actually have any form of communication or collaboration unless it's intended, for instance, in Egypt on a prime ministerial level. And that's when there begins to happen a lot more potential collaboration. But besides that, a lot of what's happening sectorally is very siloed. Unfortunately, fortunately and unfortunately, it's actually a double-edged sword here, is that climate change is multidisciplinary and that it is interdisciplinary and that every sector does get impacted. So making sure from a governance perspective that we also include communication
Yes.
between all of them so that we have strategies that address everyone at the same time is very important. You can't have a water strategy being developed by the Ministry of Water that doesn't take into account how crop yields are functioning in the Ministry of Agriculture. You can't have a development of an energy strategy in the Ministry of Energy without understanding if there's sufficient water resources to be able to help utilize that for green hydrogen, for instance, and vice versa. Problem is, again, when it comes to governance, is we are very siloed in our sectoral aspects of strategy making for the future, and climate change dictates that we need to be interdisciplinary in how we
Right.
govern our resources.
Right, but it's probably not only being interdisciplinary in how we manage resources, and great talk which has been sort of going across the region on the nexus approach more recently. It's probably as well how to listen to impacted communities. Let me give you a concrete example. I mean, I'm Upper Egyptian, and I'm from a village, from a governorate, Elminia, in Egypt, from a village in the southern part of Elminia, and where a big issue in the last 2 years for farmers in my village and around us, in the region, has been what to do with from a sugarcane production perspective, whether to grow sugar canes or not. And the community has been receiving contradicting signals from the government with regard to incentivizing or de-incentivizing sugar canes. And the siloed approach, which you were just describing, was actually pretty much at stake. But even worse, the fact that no one listened to the farmers and what they were saying. And the result has been that in this year, 2024, Egypt has faced for a short time a massive shortage in sugar production because of farmers steering away or moving away from growing sugar canes. It's only an example which I'm giving. So I'm wondering how you rate, and not only in Egypt, I do not mean to zero in on any one country, but Morocco, Jordan, or in the Gulf. How do you rate the significance of listening to impacted communities, and how it impacts policymaking?
It's 100% stakeholder involvement and stakeholder communication in any process, particularly in the just energy transition, is particularly why what makes it just versus just or make versus just an energy transition.
Right.
That's the
Hmm.
difference. Stakeholder engagement isn't just important so that we can make sure that vulnerable communities and indigenous populations are communicated and are ensured that their concerns and their demands are being brought forward, but that they are actually consulted on what primary issues deal with them the most.
Hmm.
Making, and this is a very big part, not just with farmers, this is all forms of vulnerable groups in terms of indigenous communities. We talk about women and gender issues. We talk about, when it comes to climate change, women and children are some of the most impacted. That's when much of the science has been dictated. But how many women are actually involved in the policymaking process across the Arab region? Very, very little, in fact, minute. Similarly, when we talk about indigenous communities and vulnerable groups, we need to talk about minority groups, the people in Aswan. We need to talk about the Nubians. We need to talk about Bedouin communities and how they're also surviving. A lot of these communities are being impacted terribly, but are not actually being consulted on the process. I would say that this is one of the major criticisms, of course, when we talk about stakeholder engagement and how we need to give a voice to the voiceless as much as
Hmm.
possible.
Hmm.
So
Great.
I advocate that, of course.
Okay, great. I mean, this is a very valuable point. I mean, stakeholder engagement and the different components it leads us to, be it from an indigenous community perspective or a marginalized community perspective or impoverished segments of the respective population perspective, and you name it. I mean, we are in a region which has suffered from long-standing, lingering socioeconomic disparities, as well as political inclusion crises that need to be addressed. Lama, thank you so much. It's been very, very informative. I'm grateful for your time, and I hope that we will continue our conversation. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Of course.